Members of the Royal College of Nursing have voted to reject the government's offer of a one-off payment for 2022-23 and a derisory 5% pay increase for 2023-24. Remember, inflation has hit a massive 10.4%, so it's just another crappy real terms pay cut on top of a whole decade of crappy real terms pay cuts. If nothing else, at least this government is consistent. The simple fact is that after more than a decade of real terms pay cuts, some experienced nurses have seen real terms wage cuts of as much as 20% since 2010. Just think about that. It means they now effectively work a day a week for free. And if all that's not bad enough, the government has engaged in an absolutely shameless campaign of misinformation and outright lies in an attempt to demonise them. Hold on to your seats.
We are also accountable to the British public to fund that pay rise, and what we would be, if we matched, say, to 11%, which is just above inflation right now, that would add about £1,000 to every household in this country.
It was just complete bollocks, completely untrue, and the Prime Minister shamelessly ran about the country using the same figure.
What I'm not going to do is ask ordinary families up and down the country to pay an extra £1,000 a year.
Sunak also sent out hapless government ministers to repeat it.
It costs every household just short of £1,000.
An extra £1,000 per household.
This is an important point, Laurie. If we applied this across the board, that would cost families £1,000 each.
There are about 28 million households in the UK, and the Prime Minister is telling the public a real terms pay rise for public sector workers will cost every one of them an extra £1,000.
These are robust numbers. The unions are saying that they want us to match inflation. Inflation is currently between 10 and 11%. If we gave that across the public sector, which essentially is the demand for most public sector unions, indeed for the nurses it's a higher number, that would cost £28 billion. That's £1,000 per household.
It's economically illiterate and completely untrue. The Prime Minister knows it, and so do all the government ministers shamelessly repeating it. It assumes all 28 million UK households would make exactly the same contribution in tax. But some households don't pay income tax, and the amount of tax paid varies from household to household, with the best off paying more. And any pay rise for public sector workers will itself be taxable, and that tax is included within the £28 billion, which goes straight back to the government.
Firstly, we've got to find the money to pay for it, and for every 1% increase, that's £700 million we have to find from somewhere.
Just more shameless bollocks. The BBC's head of statistics, Robert Cuff, has taken a closer look at this claim and not surprisingly found it simply didn't add up.
It's a government figure, but it applies to a different thing. It applies to a much larger group of people. Okay. So it's if you look at the NHS pay review report, for all non-medical staff, if you gave them 1% pay rise, that would come to about £700 million. But non-medical staff, largely not doctors. So that does include nurses, but it also includes radiographers, physiotherapists, ambulance staff, porters, administrative assistants, managers, senior managers on higher salaries. So once you go out that wide, then you're starting to get to those figures. But it's definitely not a figure that's relevant to discussions of resolving the pay dispute.
The government's campaign of misinformation continued with this gem from the then chairman of the Conservative Party.
The starting salary of a nurse would be £31,000. The starting salary of a nurse would hit about £31,000.
Again, just complete bollocks. The figure he's talking about includes extra earnings such as overtime and unsocial hours pay. Basic pay for a newly qualified nurse is about £27,000. The Health Secretary himself has admitted it.
Well, I thought you were going to ask me about nurses, because the first strike we're going to have on is nurses. A nursing starting salary is 25.5, and we're taking it up to 27.
And the government's campaign of misinformation continued.
And when they asked for nurses' bursaries, we made sure that every nursing student received a £5,000 grant.
The Conservative government scrapped the nurses' bursary, which previously reimbursed their tuition fees, so nurses now qualify tens of thousands of pounds in debt.
Return of the bursary, which this government has reintroduced.
By now, even Larry the Cat knows the introduction of a £5,000 maintenance grant, whilst helpful, in no way restored the bursary the government had scrapped, and in no way compensated nurses for the huge loss of having their tuition fees reimbursed, which had existed before. And when all else failed, the government even suggested nurses should drop their request for a fair pay rise to send a message to Vladimir Putin.
It's not a time to be divided, to, I hope, send a very clear message to Mr. Putin.
Heaven help us. And it just gets worse. If nurses won't accept whatever the government offers them, the Prime Minister actually wants to rob them of their democratic right to withdraw their labour by bringing in anti-strike legislation to force them to work against their will and allow them to be sacked if they refuse. Well, absolute bollocks to that. After all the sacrifices our nurses made to keep us safe during the pandemic, many are now using food banks and taking out payday loans to feed their families. Our nurses have always been there for us. Now let's be there for them.